Welcome, my loyal listeners, to another chilling episode of Shadows with Mr. Dark, where the veil between the living and the dead is thinner than you'd ever dare to imagine. I am your host, Mr. Dark, and tonight I bring you a story so terrifying, so bone-chilling, that it will leave you questioning every shadow in your home. Imagine a house steeped in tragedy, where the walls have witnessed unspeakable horrors, a place where laughter and screams echo together, and the past refuses to stay buried. This is not just a tale of ghosts, it is a tale of vengeance, regret, and the terrifying grip of the unknown. Stay with me as I unravel the haunting tale of Greenwood Manor, a cursed house in the heart of a forgotten forest, where one man's desire for freedom unleashed an evil that still lingers to this day. Will you dare to step into the shadows with me? Turn down the lights, put on your headphones, and prepare to listen to the story that will keep you awake long after the final word is spoken. Welcome to the darkness. Let's begin. Ethan Caldwell leaned against the doorway of his modest home in rural Illinois, gazing at the endless fields of golden corn swaying in the evening breeze. This was home, familiar and safe, but change was on the horizon. After months of searching for stable work, Ethan had landed a position with the State Energy Department. His assignment was in Spruce Valley, a small town nestled deep in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was a promising start, albeit in a location both remote and unfamiliar. Ethan was no stranger to hard work or change. Growing up in a small farming town had instilled in him a strong work ethic, but it had also left him yearning for something beyond the flatlands and predictable routines. The idea of working in the lush, misty expanse of the Pacific Northwest was appealing, a new adventure and a chance to build a better future. Still, the move wasn't without hesitation. The new role required him to leave behind his support system, friends, family, and the familiar comforts of home. To make the transition easier, Ethan invited his younger cousin James to accompany him on this journey. James, fresh out of college and eager for a break from his studies, jumped at the chance for a little adventure. The days leading up to their departure were hectic. Ethan's parents and siblings threw a small farewell dinner for him, filled with laughter, stories, and the kind of affection only a close-knit family can provide. Amid the warmth, his mother voiced her concern. "Spruce Valley, huh? Sounds awfully far out there," she said, her voice tinged with worry. "Are you sure you'll be okay?" Ethan smiled reassuringly. "It's just a small town, Mom. I'll be fine. Besides, it's a good job, a great opportunity." His father, always the pragmatist, chimed in. "It'll be good for him. A man's got to make his own way." Ethan packed lightly, knowing that the state office would eventually provide housing. His departure was delayed by a few days when his younger brother fell ill, but finally, on a cool September evening, Ethan and James boarded a train bound for the Pacific Northwest. Their journey was long and arduous, the train winding through the heartland and slowly climbing into the emerald forests and jagged peaks of the Northwest. By the time they reached the station at Spruce Valley, it was just before dawn. The air was damp and cool, carrying the earthy scent of pine and rain-soaked wood. The town was small and rustic, its main street lined with weathered buildings that spoke of its frontier past. As the first light of day broke through the mist, Ethan and James stepped onto the platform, bags in hand, tired but ready to take on the day. Ethan checked his watch. He had just over 24 hours before he needed to report to the local energy office. They needed a place to stay for the night, preferably something close to town. "Well, this is cozy," James quipped, glancing around at the quiet, empty streets. "Where do you think we'll find a place to sleep?" "Let's ask around," Ethan replied. "There's bound to be a bed and breakfast or an inn nearby." They approached a cab parked just outside the station. The driver, a wiry man in his 60s, tipped his cap as they approached. "Looking for a place to stay?" the driver asked, eyeing their worn luggage. Yes, Ethan said. Someplace affordable and close to town. The driver hesitated, glancing toward the misty tree line. Well, there's the inn on Main Street. Bit pricey but clean. Then there's Greenwood Manor a few miles out. It's cheaper, but... He trailed off, his face shadowed with unease. But what? James asked. The driver hesitated, then leaned in closer. Some folks say it's cursed. Strange things have happened there. I'd avoid it if I were you. Ethan chuckled, brushing off the warning. Cursed? Come on. It's just an old house, right? The driver didn't laugh. Suit yourself, he muttered, climbing back into the cab. But don't say I didn't warn you. James cast Ethan a nervous glance. Maybe we should check out the inn. Ethan shook his head. We'll be fine. Let's save the money. It's just for one night. And so, against the warnings, they made their way to Greenwood Manor, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. The drive to Greenwood Manor was shrouded in an unsettling quiet. Their cab rattled along the uneven road, the sound of its engine swallowed by the dense forest surrounding them. Ethan stared out the window at the towering trees, their shadows stretched long and menacing in the pale morning light. James sat beside him, fidgeting with his phone, though no signal bars graced the screen. Looks like we're off the grid, James muttered, attempting to mask his unease with humor. The cab driver said nothing, his eyes fixed ahead, hands gripping the wheel tightly. After a few more minutes of weaving through the winding path, they rounded a bend, and Greenwood Manor came into view. Ethan leaned forward, his breath hitching slightly. The house was enormous, its Gothic Revival architecture striking even in its decrepitude. A peaked roof jutted into the sky, flanked by spindly chimneys. Arched windows lined the facade, many of them broken or clouded with grime. The paint, once white, had faded to a sickly grey, and ivy snaked up the walls as if nature itself sought to reclaim the structure. A rusted sign swung on creaking hinges at the entrance, its faded letters spelling out Greenwood Manor. James exhaled slowly. Charming. The cab came to a halt in the gravel driveway. The driver didn't even wait for them to unload their bags before muttering, "Good luck," and speeding off, leaving the two cousins staring after him. "Friendly guy," James remarked, slinging his bag over his shoulder. Ethan grinned. "Come on, it's just an old house. We'll be out of here by tomorrow." They approached the manor's heavy double doors, one of which hung slightly ajar. A low groan echoed as Ethan pushed it open, the rusty hinges protesting the motion. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint scent of damp wood and mildew. A dim chandelier hung in the grand foyer, its bulbs flickering weakly. The walls were lined with ornate wood paneling, though much of it was scratched or peeling. A wide staircase dominated the room, its banister carved with intricate patterns now dulled by dust. A reception desk sat to one side, behind which slouched a gaunt man who looked as though he hadn't slept in days. His sunken eyes darted to the newcomers, his expression wary. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "We need a room for the night," Ethan said. "Something simple. Just one bed is fine." The man hesitated, glancing over their shoulders toward the door, as if expecting someone or something else to follow them inside. "You sure you want to stay here?" he asked after a pause. "There's an inn back in town." Ethan sighed, already tired of the warnings. "We're sure. How much for a night?" The man seemed to deflate, his shoulders slumping. $40, he said. "Cash only." Ethan handed him the money, and the man fished a key from a drawer, handing it over with trembling fingers. "Room 207, second floor, last door on the right." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Keep to your room, all right? Don't go wandering around." James raised an eyebrow but said nothing as they made their way upstairs. The staircase creaked under their weight, each step louder than the last. The second-floor hallway was dimly lit, its only illumination coming from a few weak sconces lining the walls. The air was cooler here, almost unnaturally so, sending a shiver down Ethan's spine. "Charming ambience," James said, his voice tinged with sarcasm. Ethan inserted the key into the lock of room 207. The door opened with a groan, revealing a modest room furnished with a worn double bed, a small dresser and a single chair. A large window overlooked the manor grounds, though the glass was so dirty it obscured the view. A thin layer of dust coated every surface, and the faint scent of ash lingered in the air. "Home, sweet home," Ethan said, dropping his bag on the bed. James wrinkled his nose. "Think they've heard of cleaning?" Ethan chuckled, though his laughter felt hollow. They were both exhausted from the journey, and neither felt like exploring the house. Instead, they unpacked the essentials and settled in, hoping to catch some much-needed rest. As Ethan lay on the creaky mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling, his thoughts drifted to the cab driver's warning. Cursed, he had said. It was absurd, of course. The house was old, sure, but curses, ghosts, ridiculous. Yet, as the shadows lengthened and the house settled with eerie groans and creaks, a seed of doubt took root in Ethan's mind. Outside the window, the trees swayed in the rising wind, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. Far in the distance, a faint sound echoed, a child's laughter, high-pitched and fleeting. Ethan bolted upright, his pulse quickening. James stirred beside him but didn't wake. "It's just the wind," Ethan murmured to himself. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The first night in Greenwood Manor began uneventfully enough. Ethan lay on the bed, trying to ignore the eerie creaks and groans of the old house. Beside him, James scrolled through photos on his phone, though the lack of a signal clearly annoyed him. The two of them joked about the manor's dilapidated state, but their humor was strained, a thin veil over their growing unease. "I'm just saying," James muttered, placing his phone on the bedside table. "If this place had Yelp reviews, it'd be rated 0 stars. Ethan chuckled lightly, though his gaze lingered on the room's only window. The glass was smudged and dusty, but he could make out the outline of the forest beyond. The trees swayed ominously, their silhouettes dancing against the faint moonlight. "It's just one night," Ethan said, more to himself than James. "We'll be out of here in the morning." The cousins fell into a restless sleep, the exhaustion of their journey overtaking them. But as the hours dragged on, the silence of the manor began to shift. At first it was subtle, a faint rustling sound, as though leaves were being blown down the hallway. Then came the unmistakable creak of footsteps on the floorboards, slow and deliberate, moving closer to their door. James stirred, mumbling in his sleep, but Ethan remained still, his heart thudding in his chest. He told himself it was just the house settling, an old building groaning under its own weight. Yet, as he strained his ears, the sound grew louder. The footsteps stopped just outside their door, followed by a soft, almost playful knock. 3 taps. Ethan sat up in bed, holding his breath. "James," he whispered, shaking his cousin's shoulder. "Wake up." James groaned, half asleep. "What is it?" "Someone's outside the door." James sat up, rubbing his eyes. "You're kidding, right?" The knock came again, this time louder and more insistent. James froze, his eyes darting to the door. "You weren't kidding." Ethan slipped out of bed and approached the door cautiously. He hesitated for a moment before opening it a crack. The hallway beyond was empty, dimly lit by the flickering sconces on the walls. Cold air rushed in, making him shiver. "Hello?" Ethan called out, his voice echoing slightly. There was no response. "Probably just the wind," James said nervously, though he avoided looking at the doorway. "Yeah," Ethan replied, though he wasn't convinced. He shut the door firmly, turning the lock for good measure. They tried to settle back into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the shadows above twisting into strange, unsettling shapes. Just as he felt himself drifting off, a high-pitched giggle echoed through the room. It was faint, barely audible, but it sent a chill racing down his spine. "Did you hear that?" James whispered, his voice trembling. Ethan nodded. "Yeah." The laughter came again, louder this time and undeniably closer. It sounded like a child playing just outside their door. Ethan swung his legs over the side of the bed, his heart pounding. He crept toward the door, pressing his ear against the wood. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, suffocating silence. And then, without warning, the door rattled violently, as if someone on the other side was trying to force their way in. Holy! James bolted upright, backing away from the door. Ethan stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. The rattling stopped as suddenly as it had started. For a long moment, neither of them moved, their breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Then came a new sound, a faint, wet dripping, like water leaking from a faucet. James pointed to the corner of the room, his hand trembling. "Look." Ethan turned to see a dark stain spreading across the ceiling above the dresser. Thick red droplets fell to the floor, pooling into a viscous puddle. The sight of it turned Ethan's stomach. "Is that blood?" James whispered, his voice barely audible. Before Ethan could answer, a soft whisper drifted through the room, barely perceptible but unmistakably female. "They're here," the voice murmured, each word drawn out like a sinister lullaby. Ethan grabbed James's arm. "We're leaving, now." They scrambled to gather their belongings, but as Ethan reached for the door, it flew open on its own. The hallway beyond was cloaked in darkness, the flickering sconces now extinguished. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he saw a figure standing at the far end of the corridor. A woman, her silhouette illuminated by the faint moonlight streaming through a window. Her face was partially obscured by tangled hair, but her posture was rigid, unnatural. She took a step forward, and as she moved, Ethan realized the otherworldly wrongness of her appearance. Half of her face was charred, the skin blackened and peeling. Her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, locked directly onto Ethan. "Run!" James shouted, breaking the spell. The cousins bolted down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The woman didn't follow, but her presence lingered, her burned visage etched into their minds. They reached the staircase and stumbled down to the lobby, where the caretaker, Martin, was dozing behind the desk. Ethan banged on the counter. "We're leaving! Give us our money back!" Martin jolted awake, his face pale as he registered their panic. "What happened? Did you go upstairs? What do you think?" James snapped, his voice shaking. "We're out of here." Martin didn't try to stop them. He simply watched as they stormed out of the manor into the cold night, his expression one of grim resignation. As they reached the driveway, Ethan turned to look back at the house. The windows on the top floor were dark, except for one. In it, he saw her, the woman with the burned face, staring down at him, cradling a child in her arms. Ethan shuddered, his breath visible in the chill air. "Come on," James urged, tugging at his sleeve. "Let's go." Ethan tore his gaze away and followed James, though he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman's eyes were still on him, watching, waiting. By the time dawn broke, Ethan and James had managed only a few fitful hours of sleep, huddled in their car parked on the roadside just outside the forest. Neither spoke of what they'd seen or heard during the night, though the weight of it lingered heavily between them. Ethan's mind churned with unanswered questions. Who was that woman? Why did the manor feel alive with malice? When the first rays of sunlight pierced the mist, Ethan decided to confront Martin, the manor's peculiar caretaker. Despite James's protests, he drove them back to the house. The lobby of Greenwood Manor was unchanged from the previous night, its shadows refusing to retreat even in daylight. Martin stood behind the desk, his gaunt face etched with unease as he watched them approach. "You're back," Martin said, his voice flat, though his eyes darted nervously. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan slammed his hands on the desk, his frustration boiling over. "What's going on in this place? Who is that woman? Why didn't you warn us?" Martin hesitated, his bony fingers clutching the edge of the counter. "I told you to stay in your room. I told you not to wander." "That's not good enough," Ethan snapped. "We saw her, the woman, the child, the blood." "Stop!" Martin's voice cracked as he held up a hand. His sunken eyes glistened, fear etched deep into his face. He let out a long sigh, as though resigning himself to the inevitable. "You wouldn't understand, but I suppose you deserve to know." Martin glanced around the lobby, as though checking for unseen eyes, before motioning for Ethan and James to follow him into a small back office. Once inside, he locked the door and slumped into a chair. "This place is cursed," Martin began, his voice barely above a whisper. "And not just in the way folks say about any old house. Greenwood Manor, it has blood in its walls." James shifted uncomfortably. What does that even mean? Martin exhaled slowly, as if dredging up memories he'd long tried to forget. Years ago, this house belonged to Edward Blakely. He was a wealthy man, cold and ambitious. He lived here with his wife, Eleanor, and their little girl, Clara. From the outside, they seemed like the perfect family, but anyone who knew Edward knew better. He was cruel, controlling. Eleanor was little more than his prisoner, and Clara, well, she paid the price for her father's sins. Martin's gaze grew distant as he continued. Edward wanted to be free, free of his wife, his responsibilities, his family. He had a mistress in the city, a woman he planned to marry once he rid himself of Eleanor, and one night he did just that. He locked Eleanor and Clara in a room upstairs, the same room you were in last night, and set the house on fire. Ethan's stomach churned as Martin described the scene. The townsfolk saw the flames and came running. They managed to put out the fire before it consumed the whole house, but it was too late for Eleanor and Clara. When they broke down the door, they found their bodies. Eleanor had shielded Clara with her own body, trying to protect her daughter even in death. James swallowed hard. And Edward? Martin's expression darkened. He fled that night but was eventually caught. The townsfolk didn't wait for the law to take its course. They hanged him from a tree at the edge of the property. Some say his spirit is tied to this house, trapped with the very people he betrayed. Martin leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. After the fire, no one lived here for years. But when the property was eventually sold, the stories began. Guests reported hearing a child laughing in the halls, or seeing a woman standing at the window. Some claimed they could smell smoke, even though there hadn't been a fire in decades. And then there were the disappearances. "Disappearances?" Ethan echoed, his chest tightening. Martin nodded grimly. "Workers who came to renovate the place, travelers passing through, even a few locals, people who stayed overnight and were never seen again. The owners tried to cover it up, but the rumors spread. That's why it's so cheap to stay here. Most people avoid it altogether." James shot Ethan a pointed look. "Great decision coming here, by the way." Ethan ignored him, his mind racing. "But why are they still here? The spirits, I mean." Martin shook his head. "Who can say? Maybe Eleanor and Clara are looking for justice, or maybe they're just angry, trapped." Ethan sat back, trying to absorb the weight of the story. "Why haven't you shut this place down?" Martin's eyes flickered with something akin to shame. "I don't own it. I just work here." The Blakely family still owns the land, though they stay far away. And besides, closing it wouldn't change anything. The house isn't just haunted, it's alive. It won't let go. The words sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. Greenwood Manor wasn't just a building, it was a predator, and they had stumbled into its lair. "We're leaving," James said firmly, standing up. But Ethan hesitated. Despite his fear, a gnawing curiosity rooted him to the spot. "I don't think we can just walk away. Not after last night." "You're crazy if you think I'm staying another night in this death trap," James shot back. Ethan looked at Martin, whose hollow eyes seemed to echo the despair of the house itself. "If we leave, will it come after us?" Martin didn't answer immediately, but the silence was enough. "It's best you go," Martin finally said, his voice trembling. "And pray it lets you." Ethan and James left the office, but as they stepped back into the lobby, a faint sound stopped them in their tracks. The soft, lilting laughter of a child echoing from the top of the stairs. Ethan turned to James, his face pale. "We need to figure out what's going on." James's eyes widened. "You can figure it out alone. I'm not staying." But deep down, both knew that leaving Greenwood Manor might not be as simple as walking out the front door. Ethan and James stepped into the pale afternoon light outside Greenwood Manor, their bags in hand. James seemed ready to bolt, his eyes darting toward the road where their car was parked. But Ethan paused, staring back at the house, its cracked facade somehow more menacing in the daylight. The faded windows seemed to watch them, daring them to leave, knowing full well they wouldn't. "We're going," James said, his voice firm. "I'm not spending another second here." Ethan didn't respond. The air around him was heavy with unease, and despite everything, he couldn't shake the feeling that leaving wasn't an option. Something about the house pulled at him, like a splinter in his mind that refused to let go. "Ethan!" James's voice broke through his thoughts. "Let's go, man. Now!" But just as James turned toward the car, a faint giggle echoed from behind them. The sound was soft, almost playful, but it sent chills racing down their spines. Ethan turned slowly, his breath catching as he saw the front door of the manor swing open on its own, revealing the darkened lobby beyond. James shook his head, stepping back. "Number nope, I'm out." But Ethan stepped forward. "We can't leave, not yet." "What are you talking about?" James hissed. "That's exactly what we need to do. Get in the car and drive as far from this nightmare as possible." Ethan turned to his cousin, his expression resolute. "We need answers. If we leave now, this, whatever this is, might follow us. We have to end it." James's shoulders slumped. "You're insane. But fine, if we're doing this, let's do it fast." Inside, the lobby was unnaturally cold. Shadows seemed to stretch and shift along the walls, and the faint scent of smoke lingered in the air. The manor was no longer just an old house. It felt alive, pulsing with malevolence. "Where do we even start?" James asked, his voice hushed. "The room upstairs," Ethan said without hesitation. "The one where it all happened." James groaned but followed as Ethan led the way. The stairs creaked under their weight, each step echoing like a warning. The air grew colder as they ascended, and by the time they reached the second-floor hallway, it felt as though they were walking into a freezer. The door to the room was ajar, revealing a glimpse of charred walls and broken furniture. Ethan pushed it open, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was exactly as Martin had described, frozen in time. The walls were blackened from the fire, the ceiling sagging with age. In the center of the room, a scorched bed frame stood as a grim reminder of the tragedy that had occurred there. James shivered. "This is a bad idea." Ethan stepped further into the room, his breath visible in the frigid air. "I just want to—" The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang, cutting off his words. Both men jumped, spinning to face the door, but it didn't budge when James tried the handle. "Great," James muttered. "Now we're locked in." The faint sound of laughter echoed again, this time coming from the far corner of the room. Ethan turned slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows. There, in the corner, stood a figure, a woman with long tangled hair and half of her face burned beyond recognition. In her arms, she cradled a small child whose head lolled unnaturally to one side. "Get out!" the woman hissed, her voice low and guttural. "You don't belong here!" Ethan backed away, his hands trembling. "We don't mean any harm. We just want to understand." The woman's burned face twisted into a snarl. "Understand? You can't understand." The child in her arms began to giggle, a high-pitched, haunting sound that echoed through the room. Suddenly, the air around them seemed to warp, growing heavy and oppressive, the room filled with the acrid smell of smoke as flames licked at the edges of the walls. James grabbed Ethan's arm. "We need to get out of here, now!" But the door remained sealed, and the flames grew brighter, hotter, consuming the room. The woman began to scream, a sound of pure rage and agony that made their ears ring. Ethan stumbled back, his eyes watering from the heat. He could barely see James through the smoke. "Help me push the door." They both slammed their shoulders against the door, but it didn't budge. Behind them, the woman's screams grew louder, more piercing, until they were almost unbearable. The child's giggle turned into a shriek as she leaped from the woman's arms and landed on the floor in front of them. Her small frame twisted unnaturally as she crawled toward Ethan and James, her eyes glowing like embers. "She's coming!" James shouted, panic in his voice. Ethan turned just as the child lunged at him. Her tiny hands gripped his leg, and he felt a searing pain shoot up his body, like fire coursing through his veins. He kicked wildly, but she clung to him, her strength unnatural. "Let him go!" James grabbed a broken chair leg from the corner of the room and swung it at the child, striking her with a sickening thud. She let out a blood-curdling scream and released Ethan, but the flames around them surged, roaring with renewed intensity. In the chaos, the door suddenly burst open, and the cold hallway air rushed in. Ethan grabbed James's arm, pulling him toward the exit. "Go!" Ethan shouted. They stumbled down the hallway, the woman's screams and the child's laughter chasing after them. The house seemed to shift around them, the walls warping and closing in. By the time they reached the front door and burst outside, they were gasping for air, their clothes singed, their faces streaked with soot. For a moment, they stood in stunned silence, staring back at the house. Its windows were dark, and the flames were gone, as if the fire had been nothing more than an illusion. James broke the silence. "Tell me we're done. Tell me we're never coming back here." Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped, that the house wasn't finished with them yet. Ethan and James sped away from Greenwood Manor in their car, the cold morning air blasting through the open windows. Neither spoke, the weight of what they had just experienced hanging between them like a shroud. The twisted faces of the woman and child, the oppressive heat of the flames, and the unnatural laughter echoed in their minds. James gripped the dashboard, his knuckles white. "We're done, Ethan. I don't care what you think we need to figure out. We're done." Ethan wanted to agree, but something in his gut wouldn't let him. It wasn't over. The house, its spirits, its dark history, they were like a splinter in his brain. The woman's agonized screams, the child's malevolent laughter. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that leaving now might only make things worse. "I can't," Ethan said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not yet." James turned to him, incredulous. "Not yet? What does that even mean? We barely made it out alive, Ethan. I'm not going back in there. You shouldn't either." Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "I have to. I can't just leave it like this. What if it's not done with us? What if it follows us?" James threw his hands in the air. Let it follow you then. I'm not dying for this. The argument ended in silence. Ethan pulled the car to the side of the road, just out of sight of the manor, and parked. He turned to James, his expression resolute. You don't have to come with me. Just wait here. I'll figure this out. James stared at him for a long moment, his jaw clenched. Finally, he exhaled sharply and reached into the back seat for a flashlight. You're a stubborn idiot, you know that? Yeah, Ethan said, cracking a faint smile. I've been told. The manor seemed to loom taller as they approached it, its windows dark and uninviting. The front door stood open, as if waiting for them. Ethan stepped inside first, flashlight in hand. James followed reluctantly, muttering curses under his breath. The air inside was colder than before, and the faint scent of smoke lingered. The house was unnervingly silent, the only sound their footsteps on the creaking floorboards. As they climbed the stairs to the second floor, Ethan felt a sense of inevitability settle over him. Whatever was going to happen, it would happen here. When they reached the scorched room, the door was already ajar. The air inside was icy, and their breath puffed in visible clouds. Ethan stepped inside, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was unchanged, charred walls, blackened furniture, and the lingering sense of pain and despair. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, and the room plunged into total darkness. James cursed, fumbling with his flashlight, but neither of them could see anything beyond the narrow beams of light. Then came the laughter. High-pitched, echoing and taunting, it filled the room, growing louder and louder until it was almost deafening. Ethan swung his flashlight wildly, searching for the source. "They're here," a guttural voice whispered, so close it felt like it was in his ear. Ethan spun around to see the woman standing mere feet from him, her burned face twisted in rage. "You came back," she snarled. "Good." James screamed as the child emerged from the shadows, crawling toward him on all fours like a grotesque spider. Her head twisted at an unnatural angle, and her glowing eyes locked onto him. Ethan grabbed James's arm, pulling him back. "We're not here to hurt you," he shouted at the woman. "We want to help." "Help?" The woman's voice was filled with venom. "Where was your help when we burned? Where was your help when he locked us away?" The child shrieked, lunging at James, who stumbled and fell to the floor. Ethan threw himself in front of his cousin, shielding him from the attack. The child's claws raked across his arm, leaving burning gashes. The woman screamed, the sound rattling the walls. "You will suffer as we did." Ethan realized in that moment what he had to do. He dropped to his knees, holding his hands up in surrender. "We're sorry," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry. You didn't deserve what happened to you. None of it." The woman paused, her burned features contorting in confusion. The child stopped as well, tilting her head as she studied him. "It wasn't fair," Ethan continued. "What he did to you, to your daughter, it was evil. You deserve peace. Tell us what to do. Tell us how to set you free." The woman's expression softened, though her anger didn't fade entirely. "Set us free," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You think it's that easy?" The room began to shake, and the smell of smoke grew stronger. Flames erupted from the walls, licking toward the ceiling. The woman screamed again, but this time it was a cry of anguish rather than rage. "Destroy it," she said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. "Destroy the house. Let it all burn." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. He grabbed James, pulling him to his feet. "We have to go, now." "But," James began, "no time. We need to burn it down." They bolted from the room, the flames chasing them down the hallway. The walls seemed to close in around them, the house groaning as if in protest. By the time they reached the front door, the fire was consuming the second floor, spreading faster than seemed natural. Outside, Ethan and James collapsed onto the gravel driveway, gasping for air. The flames roared inside the manor, licking at the windows and spilling out onto the roof. The house seemed to scream, a cacophony of wailing and groaning as it was consumed. Ethan watched as the fire engulfed the entire structure, the dark smoke rising into the sky. He felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The woman and child were gone now, their suffering finally over. Days later, the ruins of Greenwood Manor still smouldered, a blackened husk of what it once was. The fire department ruled the blaze an accident, citing the house's age and disrepair. Ethan and James didn't correct them. As they drove away from Spruce Valley, James broke the silence. "Do you think it's really over?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window at the forest passing by, the shadows shifting among the trees. Finally he said, "I think so. I hope so." But deep down he wasn't sure. Days turned into weeks, but the memories of Greenwood Manor remained vivid in Ethan's mind. The haunting screams of the burned woman, the child's chilling laughter, and the suffocating heat of the spectral flames were scars he would carry forever. Even though the house had been reduced to ash, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't truly let him go. Ethan and James returned to Illinois, each dealing with the trauma in their own way. James withdrew, avoiding conversations about their ordeal. His once carefree demeanor had been replaced by quiet tension, his jokes now few and far between. Ethan, meanwhile, tried to bury himself in work, but the weight of what had happened lingered. One late evening, as Ethan sat alone in his modest apartment, he received a call from James. His cousin's voice was unsteady, trembling with unease. "I've been having dreams," James admitted. "She's in them, the woman. She keeps asking why I didn't help." Ethan closed his eyes, the familiar guilt washing over him. "They're just dreams, James. The house is gone. It's over." James was silent for a moment before saying, "Is it?" Haunted by his cousin's words, Ethan decided to dig deeper into the history of Greenwood Manor. He spent hours poring over old newspapers and online forums, piecing together the fragmented story of Edward Blakely and his family. The details were gruesome but aligned with what Martin had told him. Edward had been a cruel man, a manipulative patriarch who had destroyed his family in pursuit of his own desires. But Ethan also uncovered something Martin hadn't mentioned. The land the manor had been built on had a darker history, dating back to before the Blakely family. Records indicated that the property had once been the site of a brutal massacre of an indigenous community, their sacred grounds desecrated during the expansion of settlers into the area. Some locals believed the land itself was cursed, its soil steeped in pain and suffering long before Edward Blakely's atrocities. The more Ethan learned, the clearer it became. Greenwood Manor wasn't just haunted by one tragedy. It was a convergence of centuries of anguish, a place where the past refused to stay buried. Weeks after the fire, Ethan found himself back in Spruce Valley. The ruins of Greenwood Manor were overgrown with weeds, the blackened skeleton of the house a stark reminder of what had transpired. He stood at the edge of the property, his breath catching as he felt the weight of the place press down on him once more. "I don't know if you can hear me," he said aloud, his voice trembling, "but I'm sorry for everything." The wind stirred, rustling the overgrown grass. For a moment, Ethan thought he heard a faint whisper, soft, almost forgiving. He closed his eyes, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over him. As he turned to leave, he noticed something at the edge of the ruins, a small, unburned doll lying in the dirt. Its face was charred on one side, but its glass eyes sparkled faintly in the sunlight. Ethan picked it up, his hands trembling. "I hope you're free now," he murmured, placing the doll back down. Ethan returned to his life, but the events of Greenwood Manor were never far from his mind. Occasionally, he would wake in the middle of the night, certain he'd heard a faint laugh or felt the icy chill of a ghostly presence. And though he tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, he could never shake the feeling that the spirits of Greenwood Manor had left a mark on him, one that would never fully fade. James moved away, cutting ties with most of his family and friends. He rarely spoke to Ethan, as if their shared trauma was too much to bear. As for Ethan, he continued to search for meaning in what had happened. He wondered if his actions had truly brought peace to the restless spirits, or if they had only been another chapter in the cursed history of Greenwood Manor. Years later, a developer purchased the land where Greenwood Manor had stood, with plans to build a new residential community. Construction workers arrived to clear the ruins, but their efforts were met with strange setbacks. Tools going missing, unexplained accidents, and the eerie feeling that they were being watched. One worker, a man who'd been tasked with excavating the foundation, claimed he'd heard a child's laughter coming from the woods. Another swore he'd seen a woman's figure standing at the edge of the property, her face obscured, but her presence undeniable. The project was abandoned shortly afterward, the land left to nature once more. Locals whispered that Greenwood Manor's spirits had returned, bound to the land they could never leave. And somewhere, in the deepest recesses of the forest, the burned woman and her child waited, watching, laughing, and ensuring that their story would never be forgotten.